What's up, Buckeye fans? It's Patrick Murphy here from Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports, here with another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I'm trying out a new background here. If you're watching this live, first time I've noticed that I can do this on here. So if you like it, let me know what you think. That way you don't have to just look at the background in my house as I've done in the past. I don't know. We'll see. I'm not sure how I feel about it. But anyway, let's get to it. Today's show, it will be just me, but we're going to have a lot to talk about. I am going to go through my 10 biggest storylines of Ohio State's spring practice so far. There are probably more than 10 that we could go into. In fact, I may even have a bonus one or two, depending on how we go time-wise. But I think there are plenty of things to talk about that have come out of the first 2 weeks of Ohio State spring practice, which technically, we're recording this on Friday afternoon, will finish on Saturday when the Buckeyes have their next practice. But close enough to the end of the first 2 weeks of spring practice. Let's get into the drink portion of this. I'm really low on beer just because last weekend with March Madness and whatnot, we were out and about, so didn't buy any beer. So I'm going to have some White Claw. Nice, refreshing. I was hoping it would be a nice sunny day, which makes sense for White Claw. But, yeah, I like White Claw. Those are good. Also, if you are watching this on our YouTube page, please subscribe to the YouTube page. We post all of our Ohio State video content, interviews. This time of year, there's plenty of stuff from spring practice. We just interviewed about 100 guys yesterday. All those videos are up on Bucknuts. Not really 100, but quite a few of the linebackers and tight ends. We talked to defensive linemen this week. We talked to guys at Pro Day. All those videos are up on the Bucknuts YouTube page, so please like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on a podcast platform after, please give it a 5-star review, download, all that good stuff. It all helps. It really does. I used to think when I would listen to podcasts in the early days of podcasts, like, how much does that really help? Well, turns out it does. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, we would appreciate it. If you are watching this live and you have any questions, we should have time at the end for some questions, comments. So join in the chat. Let's get a conversation going, whether it's about what I'm talking about, stuff that you think are big storylines coming out of spring or so far in spring practice, anything Ohio State related, not even Ohio State related necessarily. Throw those in the chat. We will try and address as many of those as possible towards the end. So, cheers, Buckeye fans. All right, let's get into the meat of the show today, and that is my 10 biggest storylines so far from Ohio State's spring practice. And again, we are just under 2 weeks into spring practice. So good sample size here. I think we've learned a lot. I think there's still more that we're going to learn coming down the pipeline here. There is, we've got 2 more weeks till the spring game. We've got the spring game. We'll have plenty of interviews by then, and a lot will happen between now and then. But I think we're at a good point to kind of look back and see what maybe has come out of it. So let's start with the most obvious storyline from spring practice, and this was a storyline going into spring that I think everyone was interested in, and that's the quarterbacks. You lose Will Howard. We'll talk about Will Howard later. You've got to find a replacement, right? And the Buckeyes have some good options. And I think everyone assumes, and I think it's a fair assumption that Julian Sayin is going to be the guy, former 5-star prospect, one of the top quarterbacks in the 2024 recruiting class. There's a lot to like about Julian. I'll get into him in just a second, but I don't think you can count out, and I've said this before on this show and others, I don't think you can count out, especially Lincoln Kienholz, but maybe even Tavian St. Clair. I have my doubts that Tavian St. Clair, as a true freshman, is ready to step in, especially given where he played at Bell Fountain, but the kid is uber talented. I just think it'll take a little bit more time for him to settle in as an Ohio State quarterback. But that is not to say that he doesn't have the ability to at least be in this competition and maybe push these other guys, which is only going to be a good thing. Lincoln Kienholz, he's the oldest guy in the room. He's become kind of the leader of the room by that. just by being the oldest guy, that is the thing that will need to grow for all of these guys is becoming leaders. But we saw Lincoln Kienholz at Ohio State's pro day doing some throwing stuff for the defensive backs. You can tell that this kid has developed both physically as a quarterback. I know that the lasting image for Buckeye fans of Lincoln Kienholz is that Cotton Bowl game a couple years ago against Missouri. And look, that was a disaster on a number of levels. But starting with the offensive line, if you're Lincoln Kienholz, your first time really playing a college game, I think it's unfair to judge him solely based on that performance. Plus, he's had how long to improve since then? And I think we've seen some of that. So I don't think you should just discount that. Plus, he's got the athletic ability that not every quarterback in that room or in general has. A guy who played basketball, played baseball, can do some different things on the move, stuff that can be valuable for Ohio State. So yes, Julian saying 5-star kid, but let's not count Lincoln Kienholz out completely. Early in spring practice, when we got to watch some of spring practice, Lincoln was going first a lot of the times. I think that's only natural just because he is the oldest guy. It is a little interesting because Julian obviously was the number 3 quarterback last season, and had more reps, game reps, and things like that. So interesting the way that they decided to start it. But I'm just not going to count out a guy like Lincoln. I think he has the opportunity to show that this is his team in the spring. I expect this competition to go into fall camp. But the competition is stiff because Julian Sayin is really good. Not only have we seen some of that, and I know Buckeye fans haven't really seen a ton of it just because he hasn't played much, didn't play much as a true freshman, but there was a reason he was ranked that high. You talk to people about him, even going back to last year, and it was while Julian Sayin was in the competition, I don't think anyone really expected him to win it with Will Howard transferring in and Devin Brown having more experience. But you talk to people heading into last season, and there was like, this kid's got something special. Once it clicks at the college level for him, watch out. And that's why I think he is the assumed favorite to win the job. And I would even say that I would be surprised if he doesn't win the job. Doesn't mean I'm counting out Lincoln Kienholz. I think it's fair to have a favorite while also saying this other guy could make a run at it. But clearly that is going to be one of the key storylines. We knew that going in. It's been a key talking point since then. I think every time we've talked to people at Ohio State, the quarterbacks have come up almost regardless of position, just because it is such an important decision that was going to have to be made this offseason. So clearly a key storyline from spring practice for Ohio State, and maybe even the key storyline for Ohio State. And by the way, these aren't in a particular order. It's just kind of how I jotted them down. So it's not a matter of importance. So let's see. Cheers. The next one. And again, if you have any questions, if something pops up you want to discuss during this, whether it be what I'm talking about or not, feel free to throw those in the comment section as we get more people onto this live show. Okay, continuing down my list, I'm interested in how many running backs are going to actually be a factor for Ohio State this fall. Last year, you guys obviously know Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins dominated the carries. Quinshon had 194 rushes. Travion had 144. The next closest running back, Will Howard, had 105 carries, was James Peoples at 49. And the assumption is James Peoples and West Virginia transfer CJ Donaldson will kind of step into that 2-man rotation that Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins had. That is not going to be given to them. Carlos Lachlan, the running backs coach, has been pretty clear about that everybody's going to have to earn what they get here. It's not just because you transferred in, just because you had a good relatively freshman season, all that. You're not just going to be given the keys to the car, so to speak. But let's assume that that is correct, and those two are Ohio State's top 2 running backs going into 2024. Is there room for a third guy? I think that is probably going to be determined based on how these guys. It definitely will be determined based on how these guys do, but I think it's hard enough to split between 2 guys. And Carlos Lachlan, I wrote about this a couple weeks ago. Carlos Lachlan has a history of 2 running backs being successful and getting guys to buy into this idea of the team is one. But I think the adding in a third guy is where things might get interesting. And I know Dave Biddle's talked about this a lot, that he thinks a third guy like a Bo Jackson could emerge. I am interested in a guy like Sam Williams-Dixon, who I also wrote about a couple weeks ago. This is a guy who, coming out of high school, was compared to Curtis Samuel. And we know kind of Curtis Samuel's trajectory. Started out as Ezekiel Elliott's backup, worked his way into kind of that H-back role for Urban Meyer, the Percy Harvin role, and eventually now is a wide receiver who I think has been in the NFL for 8 years or so. Not super productive, when you look at some of the other Buckeye wide receivers in the NFL, but that's a pretty damn good career to have for a guy who came to Ohio State as a running back and has really molded into a receiver. So could Sam Williams-Dixon kind of be that third back who does some other things? And I think that kind of bleeds into, the receivers. And obviously Ohio State has a plethora of receivers. Are you trying to move a guy like Sam Williams-Dixon around when you don't necessarily need to? I don't know. But he does have a versatile set of skills that maybe some of the other guys don't have. Now, he still has to be able to do some of the things that those guys can do. You can't just be a guy that comes into the game and okay, he's going to be a receiving threat out of the backfield or whatnot. He has to be able to run between the tackles and, do all those things, pass blocking, that type of stuff. I talked with him about that. That's all in the article. But I do think he does provide an interesting change of pace, and not to say that James Peoples and CJ Donaldson cannot do some of that stuff, but that's more his MO, Sam Williams-Dixon. So could he work his way in? Could they figure out a way, if Bo Jackson, I'm just going to use Bo Jackson as an example, since I know Dave's talked about him. If Bo Jackson, if he has a good spring, good summer, good fall camp, do you find a way to divide those 3 guys, the reps between those 3 guys? Is that as possible? Will guys be as willing to do that as they would 2 guys? Obviously that's less of the pie, but if you're buying into the betterment of the team and all this stuff that Carlos Lachlan preaches, and I do think, you saw it last year, those guys certainly did, and you saw the success of it, could you get them to buy into 3 guys and maybe dividing that up more? So I think that's an interesting storyline. Can there be more than 2 running backs? And we won't know that until we get closer. Obviously, outside of Donaldson, who's still new to this program, James Peoples and Sam Williams-Dixon, you got 3 freshmen that came in that are still kind of getting their feet wet. Actually, 2 freshmen that came in. One, Anthony Rogers, won't even be here till summer. So my guess is it probably ends up being 2 running backs, predominantly carrying the ball, and then maybe Sam Williams-Dixon doing some different things. Or if one of the freshmen really pops, maybe you get a package or a drive or series or something for them. But I do think it will probably end up being 2 guys, but I'm not ruling out the possibility. It didn't sound like Carlos Lachlan was either. The next one I've got, and I saw a comment about this, Robert McIntosh. He said, who do you see as team leaders coming out of practice? That is, I wrote down just leadership. And the one name that has come up the most, and it actually came up when we were talking with James Laurinaitis on Thursday. Cheers to the linebackers. James Laurinaitis, St. Louis Ram. All-time leading tackler for the St. Louis Rams, actually. Any of the Rams, Los Angeles or St. Louis. I digress. Sonny Styles. He said Sonny is not just the leader of the linebacker room, the leader of the front 7, but the leader of the whole team, which I thought was really interesting. And that comes on the back of, and Dave Biddle and I talked about this on the reaction show earlier this week. That comes on the back of Cody Simon at Pro Day saying that he believes if it were up to him, the Block O, which Cody Simon wore last year, would go to Sonny Styles. And that's not just a leadership award. I guess I don't know if award is the right word, but that is part of what makes the Blocko recipient. So I think this speaks volumes for Sonny Styles. Now, who else? Who else are going to be the leaders? Think about the guys that Ohio State lost coming out of that national championship. I mean, Will Howard. Ryan Day went to more huddle offense because of Will Howard's leadership and wanting him to be able to talk to the guys. Emeka Egbuka, Travion Henderson, G. Scott. There's guys on the offensive line, Donovan Jackson, Seth McLaughlin. And you go to the defensive side, Jack Sawyer, JT. I mean, that entire defensive line, Cody Simon, I just mentioned, Denzel Burke, Lathan Ray. I mean, really, if you go through the guys that walked out of the door after last season, pretty much all of them were, in some way or the other, pretty good leaders. And so you got to replace that. And I think that takes some time. I mentioned the quarterbacks earlier. There was talk at Pro Day or at the NFL Combine, about Julian Sayin and kind of what he needs to improve on. And the thing that everyone pointed to was like being more vocal as the quarterback. You don't have to be a vocal leader necessarily, but that is one way, especially for quarterbacks. So like which quarterback emerges in that vein? How do, who else, is a guy like Jeremiah Smith starting to come out of his shell. Carnell Tate's a quiet guy, but Brandon Inniss will definitely be a bigger factor this season in the slot, replacing Egbuka. He does not seem to be nearly as quiet. So could he emerge as a leader further? I think he was already, even though he wasn't playing a ton, a leader. Who on the offensive line? You've got a Carson Hinsman, who we assume will be the starting center now in his third year as a starter, even though he didn't start all of last season. Guy like that. I think on the defensive side of the ball, you've got Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry, who, again, haven't played a ton because of the guys they were behind, but have been in this program for a long time, know what it takes. You heard about Sonny Styles. I think Arvell Reese is starting to emerge. Davison Igbinosun, I think, is an interesting one to watch. Jeremiah Smith is a guy who talks a lot already. Great guy to talk to. So could he become that? You certainly Caleb Downs, I think, is a guy. But you're going to need a group of leaders. And I think that was one of the things that maybe didn't get talked about enough last season, other than coming out of the Michigan game and that meeting that everyone loved to see or loved to hear about after the fact. This team had a lot of good leaders, that last year's team, and you have to make that up somehow. And, guys will step up, but it's who and how, and, how that works with the rest of the team that will be key. And I think, again, early in spring practice, this is all starting to happen, but I think you are starting to see some guys, as I mentioned there, some of them returning starters, the few returning starters that there are, and some of them guys that, are stepping into bigger roles and are getting to be a leader for the first time. Cheers. And again, you have questions, Buckeye related, whatever, throw them in the chat. We'll try and get to those at the end. Now this is my first one on the defensive side of the ball specifically, but I mentioned the defensive line. You're losing all four starters. Well, they've moved CJ Hicks to, actually, let's pause on that one for a second. Let's go, before we go to CJ Hicks, the depth of the defensive line. I think that, that is interesting because I think we can probably at least pencil in the four starters on the defensive line, right? You've got Kenyatta Jackson and Caden Curry, like I said. And then in the interior, I think Caden McDonald and Edric Houston are probably your guys. And I think that's a pretty good group of four starters. I think it's different than maybe last year, but I think the talent is there, and you feel pretty good about it. But who are the guys that are going to step up behind those guys? Starting at the end, I think I mentioned already CJ Hicks. We'll talk about him more in a second. But, moving from linebacker to defensive end, or at least some sort of hybrid position, he's a guy who will add some depth. Logan George, the Idaho State transfer, assuming that his transition from one level, the FCS level football to not only FBS, but not only Big Ten, but Ohio State defense. How does that go? And then you got guys like Josh Miskins, Dominic Kirks. Among that group, and there are others, but among that group, you're going to need guys that can rotate in with Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson. On the interior, again, Edric Houston, Caden McDonald, I think will be the starters, but Tywone Malone, a guy now in his third year at Ohio State. Larry Johnson's been asked about him. He said, look, he's full-time football. He even played baseball at Ole Miss. I'm sure you guys know that. So, you are starting to see some positive things. I know he's kind of gotten lost in the weeds because he hasn't played a ton. Is he ready to be a guy who can come in and make a difference, off the bench? Jason Moore, Will Smith Jr., Eric Mensah, redshirt freshman. I think the interior of the defensive line, I probably have more questions about. I don't know about different questions, because I have questions about Logan George stepping up a level. I have questions about how CJ Hicks is going to work, as I'll get to in a second. But on the interior, we just haven't seen a ton of Tywone Malone, Jason Moore, Will Smith, those type of guys. So you need those guys to emerge this spring. And as you push towards fall camp and in fall camp and all that, it's going to be important. Depth across the team, as we saw last year, if Ohio State's going to make another run, is going to be crucial. And, that defensive line, I think, the best version of Larry Johnson's defensive lines have been the rotation that he's been able to do. So I think that will be crucial to develop. But now to CJ Hicks. And he's a guy that I know a lot of people are excited about. My question about CJ Hicks is how does it work? How do you find a role for a guy who is in his final year and hasn't really played this position, but is probably best suited for this position? And look, we could go back and we could talk about, should he have been as a rush end, edge rusher, whatever you want to call it, earlier in his career? Quite possibly. But here we are. So how do you find a role for him? Because I don't think you can have him be just, and Dave Biddle and I talked about this too on the reaction show. I don't think you can just have him be a guy who comes in, everyone knows exactly what he's doing. He's gonna come in and he's gonna rush the passer, come after the quarterback. And he may be able to have some success at that because he's athletic, because he's got the skills to do that. But I think he needs to be able to do these other things, right? To not tip the hand on the field or when he comes on the field. I wrote about CJ Hicks, I think last week. And in the article, he was compared, or he said that guys that he had talked to, Matt Patricia, who has used this hybrid position before, this kind of rush linebacker, the guys that Patricia had mentioned to CJ Hicks were former Patriots outside linebacker Willie McGinnis and Eagles outside linebacker Nolan Smith. The thing that I see with those guys, you look at McGinnis' numbers, and he played back in the 90s, early 2000s, and almost every year he's over 60 tackles, 50 tackles, something along those lines. That's a guy who's on the field a lot. Nolan Smith last season for the Super Bowl champion Eagles was playing 20 plus snaps a game. And by the end of the season was up over 50 for the last 5 weeks of the regular season. And then in the playoffs. And so my point is, these are guys that are on the field a lot. Well, if you are Ohio State, and assuming we have this right, and we know who the defensive ends are probably going to be, and we know who the linebackers are going to be, where is CJ Hicks going to fit? You're going to have to bring somebody off the field to bring CJ Hicks on. And, is he just a guy that rotates in at defensive end and he has to learn how to do all the things that the defensive end can do this offseason? Is he a guy who comes in as part of the Rushman package and, is coming off the edge? Do you go to 3-4 look or something along those lines, 3-3, where you have another linebacker on the field. I think I don't know if that has even been answered yet in the Woody, but I think it needs to be answered because I just don't think you can have this hybrid position where CJ Hicks only plays 10 to 15 snaps a game, and it's apparent in those situations what he's gonna do. Now, I guess maybe he's just a third down guy, where they're gonna pass and he comes in. But is that what CJ Hicks really wants out of his senior year? I think if you are a guy who's not played for as long as he's talked about the possibility, he had possibilities to transfer. Would you just be okay with that kind of bit role? I don't know. I know he's a very confident guy and believes in this role. It's much more at home in this role. So I'm excited to see what they do with it. And I just don't know. Maybe we'll get a glimpse of it in the spring game. But it's kind of an unknown thing. And part of me wonders, though I hope for CJ Hicks this is not the case, is this one of those things we talk about all offseason, kind of like the jack position the first couple of years of Jim Knowles, and then we just never see it? Or, he just comes in and just plays defensive end a little bit from time to time as kind of a backup defensive end. Does he end up back at, I hope for his sake that they have a plan and they're able to use it this season, because I do think it can be a weapon if you can figure out the right way to go about it. Next up, Max Clare, the tight end transferring from Purdue. I'm actually going to have a story about Max Clare up on Bucknuts later today. By the way, cheers. This is my Columbus Crew glass. Not a big fan of this logo, but the glass is very nice. I'm not even sure where we got it. But Max Clare, tight end from Purdue. Last season, 2 seasons ago, he redshirted his first year. 2 seasons ago, caught 22 passes for 196 yards. Last year, led Purdue in receptions with 51, receiving yards with 685, and receiving touchdowns with 4. Third team All Big Ten. Was one of the most sought after guys in the transfer portal from that position. So he goes in the portal. He hears from a lot of different schools. He ends up at Ohio State. Again, I'll have a story up later. You can read more about this. But that's a guy that his best attribute is route running, pass catching. At Purdue last season, that was great, right? You're Purdue. You don't have a ton of weapons. In fact, like I said, he led Purdue in all of those categories. The next best pass catcher was, in terms of receptions, John Tibbs, wide receiver, with 25 catches. In terms of receiving yards, Jamal Edrin, I think I said that right, with 365 receiving yards. So, not the weapons that you have at Ohio State, right? What he now walks into is not only a loaded tight end room with Will Kazmarek, Jelani Thurman, Bennett Christian. We can go down the line of tight ends, but also a wide receiver room that is as good, as talented, as deep as any in the country. So we talked to Keenan Bailey earlier this week, and I asked, and he's been asked this before, I believe, when we talked to him a few weeks ago, but how do you use a guy like that to the best of his abilities when you have Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Brandon Ennis? Those are just the starting 3 guys, right? Keenan, to his credit, his answer, and I'm not dismissing it at all, but he talked about Cade Stover a couple years ago when he caught, what was it? I'm pulling up the stats here. I think it was in 2023. Yeah, he caught 41 passes, 576 yards, and 5 touchdowns. He was this number 2 receiver in terms of stats behind Marvin Harrison Jr., who blew everyone else out of the water. But you also had an injured Emeka Egbuka that year. Julian Fleming, his injuries and whatnot never really materialized as the potential pass catcher he could have been. Carnell Tate was in his freshman season. Xavier Johnson was involved to some degree. But, I just think that this receiving room is so talented that I don't know what if Max Clare can have the impact as a tight end, just because you don't need to feature the tight end if you're Ohio State. Now, Keenan Bailey's response was like, he's going to be one-on-one. And if our guys can't win one-on-one, then they don't deserve to be here. And so there will be opportunities for Max Clare, but how is he going to be as a blocker? How do you get him involved in the pass game? He wants to be a more well-rounded tight end. So maybe catching passes, he's shown he can do that. He'll show it enough at Ohio State, but maybe showcasing his blocking and improving in that area, something he may not have done at Purdue, something that he thinks Ohio State can help him with. Maybe that's what he's looking at. But if you're looking at Max Clare and thinking, wow, they've got another weapon. Well, they do. I just don't know, if you're making a pecking order of guys that are going to get the ball, I think he falls, you still have to run the ball, right, too. We talked about those running backs. So, touches on the ball, Jeremiah Smith's pretty high. Carnell Tate, I think, will be pretty high. Brandon Innes, you got the running backs, all of that. How do you get Max Clare involved, I guess, and if you're going to use him as a pass catcher, which I think is his best attribute. Next one, are the offensive tackles ready? Ohio State lost two very talented tackles. Multiple really talented tackles, I guess, actually. Josh Simmons obviously tore his ACL. Donovan Jackson moves to that position. Josh Fryer, who was a 2-year starter at right tackle. So now you have to find 2 new tackles. Ohio State went to the transfer portal and found 2 tackles in Ethan Onianwa from Rice and Philip Daniels from Minnesota. But are these guys ready? When we first saw the first 2 days of practice we were able to watch, they were working with the second team. It was, they were working with the second team. But I think the assumption is that these guys are likely to be the starters. I think it's just a question of, are they ready? I've talked to people from Minnesota who were surprised that Ohio State was as interested as they were in Philip Daniels, who they certainly thought Minnesota would develop into a pretty good tackle, but he was forced into starting because of injuries. So, is he ready to be a starting right tackle at Ohio State? I think there's some at Minnesota that would question that. Ethan Onianwa was one of the top tackles in the transfer portal, and a guy that a lot of programs were after. But I know in talking to some people that there is not concern at all, but just that there is certain areas of improvement that he, strong and things like that, but maybe footwork and quickness are question mark. So, are these guys going to be ready to start from day one, or will Ohio State need to look at, some of the guys that have been in the program already? We saw Austin Saraveld, for instance, out at tackle. I think he was at right tackle when we were out at practice. This is a guy who played guard exclusively last season, started the season when Donovan Jackson was hurt at guard, and then obviously worked his way back in, was part of that 3-man, because of the injuries, was part of that 3-man rotation at guard, Ian Moore, could that be a guy? One of the Armstrong brothers. But I do think Ohio State looked at Ethan Onianwa and Philip Daniels and thought those are guys we should bring in that can at least potentially be the starters in 2025. It's just a matter of how ready they will be by the start of the season. And, look, there is no easing into this season, which is something I think we'll talk about a lot throughout this offseason. You are starting out of the gates with Texas. So there's not time for, like last season, you could ramp up, right? There just isn't that. So these tackles have to be ready from the get-go because you're going to go against good guys in Texas, right? So, and that's true at every position, but bring it up there. Again, if you have questions, I know we've gotten a lot more people on the live stream since we started. If you have any questions about anything I've been talking about, if you have any comments about who you think or what you think are some of the biggest storylines, maybe ones I don't get to, throw those in the chat. I will try and address some of the questions, comments, if there are more by the end. I've seen a few in there, but if you're watching this, throw those in there. I love to have conversations with you guys instead of just talking to myself as it seems. So please, let's make this a more conversative podcast out there. Moving right along. Next storyline, changes under Matt Patricia. I think Ryan Day's made it clear that Ohio State has its defense. That defense isn't going to change too much. I think what Jim Knowles brought is what Ryan Day wants this defense to be, more or less. And you saw that with promoting Tim Walton to co-offensive coordinator, so he can help because he's worked in this defense. Matt Patricia will have a big say. But Matt Patricia also brings Matt Guerreri will have a big say. Matt Patricia also brings his experiences, right? Working with the Patriots and the success they had. What does that add? What does that take out of this defense? Matt Patricia has talked about and has proven in the past that he is very much willing and able to cater the defense to the personnel that he has. What does that mean for Ohio State? How does that change? We talked about CJ Hicks, right? He's used those hybrid positions before. What other things might look a little different? And we even saw it last season as Ohio State changed throughout the year, especially after that Oregon game. You saw Caleb Downs playing closer to the line at times. You saw nickelback Jordan Hancock dropping deeper, things like that. What are the tweaks? What does Matt Patricia do with this year's personnel and with his ideas that are maybe different than a year ago? Look, Ohio State had the best defense in the country. It's going to be hard to do that again, not necessarily to have the best defense in the country, but to replicate that entirely with so much newness. But I still think this defense can be really good. The personnel is there to be really talented. And Matt Patricia's tweaking of things, because again, I don't think much will change. Let's see what that's going to be. And I don't think this time of year has that fully formed yet. I think we'll be able to talk about that more, but I still think that's a topic here during spring as Matt Patricia kind of gets settled and sort of gets comfortable within coming back to college and all that. Sticking with coordinators, Brian Hartline. He's been the offensive coordinator. He's been the co-offensive coordinator. Now he is the offensive coordinator again, but he is now also going to be the play caller. He is running the offense. He is taking over the Chip Kelly role from a year ago. Ryan Day wants to remain the CEO. He said the first time we spoke with Brian Hartline after this promotion title, I don't know what we want to call it, that this won't take away from him his work with the wide receivers and what the wide receivers have done. Okay, but now you have all of this added responsibility. So I asked Brian Hartline, how do you manage this? He talked about the wide receivers in the room being, the guys at the top, Carnell Tate, Brandon Innes, Jeremiah Smith, Bryson, guys that have been in the program, know how this thing goes. They will be able to not run things, but they can kind of keep things going the way they're supposed to. Devin Jordan is his assistant. That's a guy who he can lean on quite a bit. But he also talked about organization and things like that, and being able to feel when he's getting pulled too far one way and coming back centered. And I think this will be a interesting thread to follow once the season starts, because I don't think we'll know too much about it. I think Brian Hartline, a smart enough guy, a talented enough guy, has proven, not just his work with wide receivers, but he was heavily involved in the passing game, game planning and things like that last year. Like, he's earned this job, but it's just about figuring out how you do all this while also continuing to coach and recruit at a key position. And I think, we've seen it before, guys do it all the time. This isn't new, but he's doing it for the first time, trying to balance these two things. And the hope from an Ohio State perspective is it doesn't take away from anything. And Brian Hartline does not believe that it will, but I think that is an interesting storyline this spring and really this whole offseason until we get to the fall and we get to see Ohio State's offense. Okay, does it look right? Because you know how we are, we know how you are. Everybody will judge however it looks week 1 against Texas, right? Ohio State's offense goes out and puts up 35 points and 400 yards on Texas defense, regardless of how good Texas defense is or isn't. Brian Hartline will be applauded for that. If Ohio State's offense struggles, is he trying to do too much? These type of things, those questions will be asked as well. So, something that I'm going to kind of follow as we get closer to the season. And then as the season begins, young players that could emerge. And I think a lot of times when we talk about young players at Ohio State, look, it's fun to get excited about the new guys, right? We all do it in whatever sport, whether it be college sports and freshmen or transfer guys coming in, whether it be professional sports and free agents or rookies or any of that. Like, the new guys are exciting because it's new. And, you hear all of these good things in the offseason. I often, with freshmen, I did it with Jeremiah Smith last year. Despite what I was hearing, it was like, look, I've heard about all these star freshmen before, right? And let's see it. Well, I was wrong there. Jeremiah Smith was a stud as a freshman. I think this year's different, and I'm not going to be as much pump the brakes. Not that I think there'll be a ton of freshmen that are, starting or anything like that, but just because of how many guys Ohio State lost and the need for depth and all that, I think there's going to be freshmen that have to play. And Ryan Day said as much, and he said, how impressed he's been with these freshmen coming in early and, physically being ready, picking things up quickly. I saw a question here about from Bootzilla. Do you see Devin Sanchez emerging as a starter and forcing Davison Igbinosun inside to play the nickel? I don't think Davison Igbinosun is going to play the nickel. I do think Devin Sanchez is one of these guys that could emerge. In how big of a role this season, I don't know. I mean, you saw there's a lot of cornerbacks, right? But you saw last year, Jermaine Matthews, granted not a freshman, but he forced his way onto the field and became a 3-man rotation instead of 2 guys taking most of the snaps. Could Devin Sanchez do that? Now, there are other guys too. Bryce West, Aaron Scott, Lorenzo Stott, there's a ton of wide receivers, cornerbacks that he's going to have to get by. But somebody that the Buckeyes are very excited about, that I think as we go through this offseason, a name to kind of keep in mind in terms of what he can do. We talked quarterback earlier, Tavian St. Clair. I don't think he's going to be an immediate impact guy, but you never know. Quincy Porter Jr., he was a guy that stood out a little bit in some of the practices we watched, a 5-star receiver. Again, very deep room, going to be hard to work your way in there as a true freshman, but we saw a guy do it last year, right? Carter Lowe is an interesting one on the offensive line. I mentioned those tackles. Could he work his way in early? It's been a while since Ohio State started a true freshman on the offensive line. I think Michael Jordan was the last one, but at least be ready. We saw last year, right? With the injuries on the offensive line, you got to be ready. I'm just kind of looking through. We just talked to Riley Pettijohn yesterday. Again, only playing 2 linebackers, assuming Ohio State sticks with that. It's going to be hard. Zion Grady, if you need depth at defensive end, we were talking about defensive line depth. He's a kid Ohio State fought very hard to make sure he stayed in this class. That's a guy I think as an edge rusher, you could potentially see some. I mentioned Bo Jackson earlier. Dave is very high on him potentially having an impact. So, which of these guys, and I could go all the way through this 21-man class, but which of these young players emerges? And that doesn't have to be, and here's another one from Robert Howard on Devin Sanchez. I think Devin Sanchez loses black stripe following tomorrow's scrimmage. It is interesting. We haven't seen any black stripe announcements yet, but you're right. The scrimmage might be the time when those start to kind of roll in, a guy or two, and then we start to see it happen more regularly. But they are going to need members of this freshman class to emerge and at least be part of the 2 deep at some positions. I think if I named a handful of guys like I just did, I might hit on some. I'd probably miss on some others. It's going to be up to how these guys work, what opportunity comes their way, things like that. So I think this year it is more prevalent than others because of how many guys walked out of the door, how many experienced guys walked out of the door. So let's see. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's 10. All right. I said I had some bonus ones. We'll get into those kind of quickly, and then I'll see if there's any questions, anything in the chat. Again, if you have anything you want to bring up before we call it a day, put those out there, and I will grab some of those at the end. But special teams, and I think there was a question about special teams. Let me go back and look. Oh, yes, Robert McIntosh. Patrick, have you seen any changes with special teams? To answer the question, no, but we've only seen 2 practices, and all of special teams was punt. There, we got to see some of the guys that were returning punts, but I'm seeing if I have that. Yeah. Guys like Caleb Downs. Make sure I jotted down the numbers here. So I want to make sure with guys switching numbers, I don't say the wrong names here. Caleb Downs was one. Brandon Innes, Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, James Peoples, Brandon Innes. I think I already said him. Bryson Rogers. Yeah. So look, I don't think all of those guys are going to return punts. But we've seen it before, right? There was a big hysteria when Marvin Harrison Jr. was back there returning punts in spring practice, and I don't think he ever returned a punt for Ohio State. But so we haven't really seen anything because that's all we've seen from punts. Though I will say, I think that punter competition and the kicking competition will be interesting. And I think special teams in general, and this is something I'd like to ask Ryan Day at some point. There's just been a lot of things to ask, and in the sessions we've had, we've really only gotten one question. I did have one follow-up one time, but for the most part, because there's been so many questions, we've been limited to one. So I'd like to ask at some point about this, but the way that Ryan Day did the special teams coaches last year, with everybody sort of having a little bit of a role, is he going to stick with that? I think there were rumors early on that he might bring in somebody to focus on special teams. That hasn't happened as far as I know. I could be wrong on that. If I've missed anything, I apologize. But how, it's not like special. Yeah, they had a punt return for a touchdown and with Caleb Downs, but it never became the weapon that they talked about. They were having a kicker competition, or at least that's what Ryan Day said, going into the college football playoff after missing a couple field goals in the Michigan game, which I thought was a little weird because Jaden Fielding was pretty good outside of that game. But there was a kicking competition. Punting wise, Joe McGuire. Okay, he had some good ones. He had some not so good ones. They brought in Nick McClarty last year, has a huge leg. I thought, at least in the little bit we saw of him in the 2 spring practices we watched, looked more consistent. I thought that too in the bowl or in the college football playoff practices we got to watch. So yeah, I think there are some questions about special teams that we'll need to hit on at some point. But again, it's just been, there's so much going on during spring practice that's kind of lowered down. And then the last bonus thing I wanted to hit on was Pro Day. And I think the biggest thing for me, and the biggest thing for most people, was Will Howard and just the way he threw the ball. Dave and I talked about this. I think he helped himself a lot. I wrote about Will Howard earlier today, if you want to read that on Bucknuts. And he talked about how, basically, he said it, coming to Ohio State was the best decision he ever made. Dave Biddle said on the reaction show that he talked to Will Howard's mom. Will Howard said the same thing, or she said the same thing. So, I think he was through 3 incompletions during that 20-plus minute session. You can watch all of those throws on the Bucknuts YouTube page. We've got video of that. But 2 of those were drops. So I think they were on the money and could have been caught. So I think he really helped himself. I thought he looked good. I thought he looked confident. But some other guys, Dave and I talked about this. I think Emeka Egbuka helped himself. I know he was frustrated with his 40 time, even though it was pretty good, which shows like the standard that he plays at. Jordan Hancock is a guy that I think helped himself with some of the stuff he did at Pro Day. Josh Fryer, he hadn't had an opportunity. G. Scott, both of those guys weren't invited to the NFL Combine. I talked to G. Scott Sr. briefly afterwards, just asked how he felt about it. And let me tell you, he felt pretty good about what G. Scott Jr. did. And those are two guys that are probably towards the end of the draft or undrafted guys, but you saw the impact that they made on a national championship roster. And, I think you can assume that they can carry something into the NFL. Donovan Jackson, I think too, with some of the stuff he was able to do. He's been talking to teams about both guard and tackle, which is crazy to think about given he hadn't played tackle till the final, handful of games at the end of the regular season. So what's going to be interesting about this draft class is like, I don't know if you'll see a ton of first round picks, but I do think there's a really good shot that Ohio State could tie the record of picks taken in one draft from a single school. I think there isn't that superstars early in the draft. I mentioned Emeka Egbuka, maybe one of the two defensive ends, maybe both the defensive ends go in the first round. Denzel Burke, maybe. But I don't think the first round will be this who's who of Ohio State guys necessarily, but I think they will be throughout the draft. There will be a lot of Ohio State talk. And I think you saw that Pro Day. There's a lot of talent there that could show up. All right, let me see if we've missed anything in the chat here. Shadrick Bell, sorry if I mispronounced that, said Peoples equals RB1. He's a constant big play waiting to happen. Yeah, I'm really excited about him. Really excited about what he can be. And I think the approach, the stats with running backs, I don't think under Carlos Loughlin are going to be huge for any, unless they just have a Derrick Henry guy that comes along. But I think they're going to continue to try and rotate guys. And I think that you'll see that doesn't necessarily mean that these guys aren't going to be, appealing to the NFL or whatnot. Maybe they don't climb up the Ohio State record books as quickly, but I think they don't have as much carries on them. And if they're productive without as many carries, that's even more reason to draft a guy. Chaz Hahn says, I'm curious about the defense. Arguably one of the best D of all time. How do you feel about this reload? I think I feel pretty good. I'm not gonna tell you how to think, because of the talent and because the guys that have played. Again, yeah, you lose all four defensive linemen, but the four that we assume are going to start played a pretty big role last season, and on the ends even before that. Linebacker, you got Sonny back. Arvell Reese played a good amount last year, right? Cornerback, you lose Davis, or you have Davison Igbinosun back. You bring in Jermaine Matthews. He played a good amount in the second half of last season. In the slot, we'll see what happens at nickel. I think Lorenzo Styles is probably the favorite, but again, that's a really deep room, and guys are going to fight their way on the field. But Lorenzo played some. If it's not him, then a guy that beat him out. Safety, not a ton of experience next to Caleb Downs with Jalen McClain and Malik Hartford, but enough, I think, that you've seen some things. Plus, you're playing next to Caleb Downs. So, and then you bring in Matt Patricia, who I've been pleasantly surprised about. I like Tim Walton having a bigger say in things. I like Matt Guerreri's there. So I think I still feel pretty good about it. Will it be as elite as next year? I'm not ready to say that, but I do think that there's a lot of things to like about it. Chadwick Bell also said Sam Williams-Dixon equals Swiss Army knife for sure. We talked about Devin Sanchez. Let me see. I haven't read. There's talk about Connor Stallions had an interview with another outlet. I haven't seen it. I'm not going to talk about it. I don't know enough about it. Robert Howard said Edric Houston and KJ Kenyatta Jackson are about to break out this year. Yeah, I mean, look, if you're Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry, this is it. This is your year to show you. You have waited and stayed in the program and been loyal behind JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, man, it is your time. You got to go out and do it. Sage, Ohio, I think Hartline wants that in-game experience with the offense and will coach on the field. Yeah, that's another thing with Brian Hartline that I forgot to mention. With him being a first-time offensive coordinator, play caller, where does he call plays from? He's been asked about it. Ryan Day's been asked about it. Hasn't been decided yet. I always think it makes more sense to call from the box, but I've never done it. So I will leave that up to Ryan Day and Brian Hartline. Let's see if there's anything else here. Robert Howard said defensive line depth is my only question mark. What are you hearing in regard to development in LJ's D line room? I think it's good. I think, you say what you will about some of the stuff last year, especially the first half of the season with the defensive line and kind of the pressure and whatnot. But, JT Tuimoloau got better throughout his 4-year career, right? Did he get better enough to leave after 3 years? No, probably not. And who knows why that is. Jack Sawyer, I think, definitely got better. I think if you don't mess around with him at that Jack role, and I'm not saying that was the wrong decision at the time, but if he doesn't have a year of kind of playing this Jack hybrid role, then I think he's probably in a much better spot earlier to do some of the things you saw him do kind of the second half of 2023 and in 2024. So I think there, you look at the guys in the interior. I mean, Tyleik Williams was a beast. The development of Ty Hamilton is so similar to his brother. It's crazy, who also was coached by Larry Johnson. You see Caden McDonald coming along last year on those goal line packages. Edric Houston's move from defensive end to the 3 technique. That shouldn't be as easy as it was for Edric Houston, I don't think. So some of that is definitely on the players, but LJ certainly has a lot to say in that. So they need to develop more depth, no doubt about it. It's a position that you could, especially the interior, you could see them move into or look for the transfer portal in the spring when it opens. So yes, it's certainly a concern, but I do think Larry Johnson continues to develop. Will Starr said Coach Day is on Colin Cowherd right now. That's interesting. I didn't know he was going to be on there. I like Colin. I know a lot of people don't, but I think while I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, I think he's a good interviewer and usually gets some stuff out of people that others don't. Let's see if there's anything else here. Oh, Will Starr said it's not live, so scratch that. All right. Robert McIntosh asked, do you see anyone committing soon? I'm going to be honest with you. With how much there's been going on this week with spring ball and pro day, like I talked to Bill Kurlick quite a bit. We usually talk about what's coming on stuff, what he thinks in terms of commitments, things like that. We really haven't talked much this week. So obviously, I'm sure you guys are aware the 2 offensive linemen that committed, Tucker Smith and Sam Greer. Both good gets from Tyler Bowen, new offensive line coach, who I think is doing a great job, at least on the recruiting side of things, which was the knock on Justin Fry. But I wouldn't want to say anything without having talked to Bill about it because that's not my expertise. But look, they've had a ton of kids in for these spring practices. I think you'll continue to see the booms. I'll just leave it at that. Doug Shepard Sr., do you think it will be Peoples gets a third of the carries and CJ Donaldson and Bo get the other 2/3? If I'm guessing right now, I think it looks a lot like last year with James Peoples and CJ Donaldson. Not in terms of how they're used. They're not the same as Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, but I do think that in terms of the split, I said it before. Let me see if I still have it pulled up here. Quinshon had 194 carries. Trey had 144. So how that breaks down in terms of who gets what, I don't know. We'll find out. But I think it will be 2 guys unless somebody really pushes for something. Let's see. Anything else before we sign off? Robert McIntosh says he thinks Hartline, would coach from the press box with less distractions, especially being his first year. Yeah, I think that makes sense. The one thing I will say is that Brian Hartline and his, being able to talk to guys and feel, the guys and things like that, I think is important to him. So I think he'd prefer to be on the field if he could. I'm just guessing here. Just based on what he's, kind of seeing him on the field as the wide receivers coach and stuff. But I don't know. They'll mess around with it as they go through practices, especially into fall camp, I think. But they'll figure it out. And even if you have to move in season, I think that's something you can do. All right. We're going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for the comments, questions. Again, I'd like to create more conversation and do this live. We have talked about maybe moving when we do this. I usually do it Thursday or Friday afternoon, which I know a lot of people are at work. So maybe in the off season, we'll do some weekend happy hours and, see if we can get more people in there. Not that I don't think this is great. This is a great turnout. But I love to have the conversation. I love people talking in the chat. If you're talking to each other, hopefully everybody's keeping it nice and then asking questions that then I can answer and we can talk back and forth. That's one of my favorite parts about doing this stuff. So thank you guys for tuning in. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel, like the videos. That helps us out a lot. And obviously we put a lot of stuff on our YouTube page. If you're listening to this podcast, 5-star review, leave us a good comment. That helps tremendously. Thank you guys and cheers.